Oh, have I been waiting to do this one. Hello everyone. Continuing the Pride Parade, it's time to tackle gender. Anime has a weird fixation when it comes to gender identity. In the US and some other countries, we like to make sure everything is either explicit and obvious, or blink and you'll miss it if censorship goes too far. But in anime, you'll usually know if a character is trans or non-binary, but it won't be directly stated. Something else I noticed putting this list together is that portrayals of queer characters in anime tend to have a lot more variety in how they are portrayed. They aren't restricted to a tiny amount of screen time, or getting a lot of focus either with a very bad portrayal or a mostly good one. And I found quite a few of them, hence why this video took as long as it did. I'm actually very excited for this one, as I finally have a chance to talk about several of my favorite characters in the entire medium. If you're new here, once again, hello, I'm Kylan. I'm aro-aspec trans non-binary, specifically bigender. I've got a much better understanding of the trans experience than I do other queer experiences, so I'll probably have a lot more to say in this video than I did the previous one, but I am only one person, so my experience is still limited. And if you have your own queer experience or characters that you love and would like me to cover, feel free to mention them in the comments. Without further ado, let's get started. But before we begin the list proper, there's something I ought to address about how Fruits Basket handles gender. Two members of the Soma family, those being Momiji and Ritsu, cross-dress. Momiji just seems to do it because he wants to. Ritsu meanwhile does it because he feels more comfortable presenting feminine. Though we find out later that this is a coping mechanism rather than a statement of identity, and disappointingly, both characters stop doing it before the end of the story. Momiji just doesn't seem to want to anymore, and Ritsu moves past what scared him and gives away all of his women's clothing. Disappointing, but much like Hatsuharu and Ayame's bisexuality that I talked about last time, it's not treated as something negative. Indeed, Momiji's cross-dressing habits are defended by his friends when a student gives him trouble about it. But the character I wanted to talk about for this section is Akito. Spoilers for late in the series, by the way. Akito is a girl who is forced to present male for most of her life, because that's what her mother wanted. She ends the series having reclaimed her identity, now dressing much more feminine. While Akito was not assigned male at birth, she was forced to live as a gender that was not her own, only for her to return to living as her true self. In a sense, it is a very transcoded narrative, because while Akito's body was always that of a cisgender woman, she was living as an identity that was not her own. But of course, like conversion therapy in our world, it only succeeded in making her suffer until she is able to live as a young woman again. I've seen accidental trans allegory before, but this is probably the closest I've seen without it technically being canonical trans rep. Part of me wishes it was, especially with Fruits Basket's tendency to present queer identities only for the ending to be painfully heteronormative. But I'll still give credit where credit is due. And continuing on the subject of trans allegory, though in this case it's a lot more debatably not allegory, Ranma half. In case you haven't checked out the 90s anime or the recent Netflix reboot, I'll give you a quick rundown. Ranma Saotome is a teenage boy traveling the world with his father, Genma Saotome, and he's training in martial arts. One day they happen to do some training above a bunch of cursed springs and both fall in. Genma falls into the spring of drowned panda, so he turns into a panda when he's splashed with cold water. Ranma, on the other hand, fell into the spring of drowned girl, so he turns into a girl when he's splashed with cold water. Both of them can change back with a splash of warm water, but the ever-present threat of transformation from a stray hose or bucket is inconvenient. To make matters worse, Genma promised Ranma's hand in marriage to a girl named Akane Tendo who hates boys. To somehow make matters even worse, both Ranma and Akane have horny knuckleheads showing up from across town and even across the world on some occasions, who all want one of them. Some want both of them, not realizing that Ranma is also the pigtailed girl. Ranma is never able to get the curse lifted, and he just has to adjust to having a female body half the time for the rest of his life. And somehow he does. It's a bit different between the remake and the 90s anime, but while uncomfortable at first, Ranma does eventually get used to it, and even seems okay in feminine clothing. One might call that gender fluid or even bigender, though much like Fruits Basket, Sailor Moon, and other anime or manga that released around that time period, the ending is still heteronormative. And if I'm being honest, a lot of the humor is viewed as in poor taste today, especially the amount of laughs expected to be derived from perverted actions. Still though, I appreciate what it was able to accomplish for queer rep, despite it being unintentional. Kicking off the list proper, let's start with Sailor Moon once again, which I just realized is the third anime in a row that's a remake of an older series. And if you watched my last video on this topic, you know exactly where I'm going with this. Haruka Tenno, aka Sailor Uranus, proves that non-binary folks can be just as magical as their cisgender counterparts. All the Sailor Guardians outfits are on the feminine side, but outside of that, Haruka can be seen in both masculine and feminine presentation in both the original anime and Crystal. He seems to do it on a whim, and no one comments on it, but she is still referred to as a princess once the story gets that far. But outside of Sailor Guardian duties, he mostly sticks with masculine presentation. Only when asked does Sailor Neptune explain her partner's gender, described as having the strength of a man and a woman without needing to limit herself. In this time and place, we would call that bigender like I explained last time, and indeed, Haruka doesn't seem to experience any form of gender dysphoria, implying that he's already content in her gender identity and expression. But as with the previous two anime, that are also remakes of decades-old series, they only took things so far. Our understanding of gender and sexuality have come a long way since any of these manga began. They were all revolutionary for their time, and I still appreciate them and their remakes even today. But moving on to something a bit more modern, I've covered the wife, it's time to cover the husband. Yep, fun fact, Togashi and Takeuchi are a married couple if you didn't already know that. In case you were wondering how this happened. Togashi has quite the history as a successful, even genre-defining shonen mangaka. I haven't read or watched Level E yet, which I'm told has plenty of its own merit and a storyline centered around gender, but I hope to get to it in the future. Just looking at Hunter x Hunter, it has one character I simply couldn't make this video without covering. Alluka Zoldyck. Alluka is one of the most common examples of a transgender character in anime, and it's very easy to see why. She comes from a very strict family, specifically one full of assassins that think torture is okay to prepare someone for the world. Alluka possesses a very strange ability, which Togashi has only confirmed more recently is a form of Nen, just like almost every other supernatural ability we see in the series, but a very special kind. Basically, she makes requests of people that can be as small as "give me your hairpin," or as big as "give me your vital organs," and if the person fails to grant 3 of them, a second personality named Nanika will take over, and the person will die in extremely brutal fashion, possibly along with their entire family, based on the enormity of the requests. But if a person completes all of the requests, they get to make a wish. Because of how dangerous she can be, the Zoldicks keep her locked up deep within their home. The only true connection she has is from her youngest older brother, Killua, who also happens to be the only one who respects her gender identity. Lucky for Alluka then, that Killua is willing to fight tooth and nail to get her out of that toxic environment so she can see the world. Sounds good, and for the most part it is. But there is a moment when he tries to get rid of Nanika, telling her to go away, and Alluka rightfully flips. She tells Killua to apologize right away because Nanika is a part of her, albeit a very dangerous part. Thankfully he does, and he finds a way to prevent anyone else from exploiting or falling victim to her powers, making sure both of them have all the love and affection they'll need. And he introduces them to Gon. Sure, most of this conflict stems from Alluka's powers and not her identity, but this was a surprisingly sweet story about the need people, trans people in particular, have for a sense of freedom, validation, respect, and connection. Quite the bright spot in a series as dark as Hunter x Hunter. Keeping up the darker themes, let's talk about Soul Eater. Soul Eater is an anime about a bunch of students at the Death Weapon Meister Academy, or DWMA, where the students are either people who can transform into weapons, or Meisters who wield said weapons against various supernatural threats, such as unruly spirits or scheming witches. Relatively early in the series, we're introduced to this awkward pink-haired kid named Crona, who's suffering from a few issues, including being the guinea pig for a particularly dangerous witch named Medusa, leaving them with black blood and a case of madness. They're also non-binary, and their sex assigned at birth is literally never stated. Initially antagonistic because they were working for Medusa, eventually enough encounters with a very determined and empathetic Maka Albarn managed to break down the barriers they had set up. It terrifies Crona at first, but they do slowly grow closer to the main crew, weird and eccentric as they may be. Like Alluka, Crona starts off in a really troubling place with no community willing to understand them, but a particularly determined outsider who is willing to see the humanity in them gives them a chance to make a life for themselves. There are bumps along the way, and Medusa does try taking Crona back like a controlling family member, but this effort eventually fails. I don't think it was intentional, but this story really resonated with me as a trans NB person. We struggle to find community and can be easily manipulated when we're vulnerable, but we are no less capable of thriving. Speaking of thriving in the face of adversity, it's time to talk about Komi Can't Communicate. This series is about a girl named Komi Shoko who, despite being super anime pretty, is also super anxious in social situations. But she does want to make friends, 100 friends at that. And this guy, Tadano, offers to help. And he starts off with someone who can make friends with just about anyone in school. Osana Najimi, who apparently used to identify as male, but is now living as a girl. During the rest of the anime, their gender is treated as ambiguous, but they don't seem to care. The best I can determine is they are either genderqueer or non-binary. And they are a blast whenever they're on screen, always willing to brighten up a room. Like many trans people I know, and I'm kind of including myself in this, they are quite the fun-loving free spirit. This is what happens when someone isn't able to live as their true self for a portion of their life and has to break societal convention just to do so. They tend to be more willing to break conventions in general and act on how they truly feel. And that's something we could all stand to do a little more. Next up is... The Disastrous Life of Saiki K. Yes, we're talking about this series again. I found this one out by accident, but apparently the extremely powerful psychic who just wants to be left alone, but can't because he's in a comedy anime, has one more secret up his sleeve that none of the other characters know. So he can shapeshift, including into various animal forms, and into a human girl, which, like the rest of his powers, he uses to get out of trouble from time to time. The thing is, he's had this ability since before he was born. Indeed, he used it a bunch of times and it got laughed off as the ultrasound malfunctioning. They thought he would be male when he was born and were surprised when that turned out not to be the case for a minute, until he went back to being a boy. In the manga, it's described as him being, quote-unquote, fairly certain his gender is male. It's a little hard to say for sure, but he was technically assigned female at birth, or rather was about to be. While it's not as clear as I'd like, the simple fact that he made adjustments as he was figuring things out as an infant with shape-shifting powers makes him a trans icon in my book. He doesn't have a problem with presenting female if the situation calls for it, but I don't really have a problem with that, as not all trans people experience gender dysphoria. One could also interpret that as Saiki being secure enough in his identity that it doesn't bother him. Moving on to something a little more explicit, Zombieland Saga. This one is pretty weird, but it's also pretty adorable. Basically, a bunch of Japanese girls died, in at least one case due to a meeting with Truck-kun, and have been resurrected to be idols. Things go well, albeit a little awkward as the girls build up their reputation without literally falling apart. But then this guy shows up, and it looks like he starts to recognize their youngest member, Lily, from who she was before zombification. Then Lily starts giving a few more details about her past. Apparently this guy is her dad, and he was perfectly okay with her presenting female, but then he put too much stress on her acting career, and when combined with the distress of starting to grow single facial hair, caused her to die. Thankfully, she doesn't have to worry about male puberty anymore, but she can't let her father know she's returned from the grave. What she can do is give an absolutely heartbreaking performance with a song meant to help him move on. Simultaneously really wholesome and really tear-jerking. Still though, I do have to give it props for being one of the only anime in this video that acknowledges how painful gender dysphoria can be. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Senpais in Otokonoko after I ended last video on it. Makoto is the title character after all. Their story is the primary conflict of the series. So, what exactly is their deal? Well, Makoto has been secretly presenting female at school for years now. Specifically secret from their mom, who doesn't approve of it. But Makoto genuinely prefers presenting female a lot of the time, and really doesn't like talking about it. And when Saki confesses her feelings, Makoto has to tell her the truth expecting rejection, only for Saki to turn out to be a raging bisexual who now wants her senpai even more. That little bit of acceptance kickstarts Makoto's journey to living as their true self, even outside of school. Perhaps even reconciling with their mother. Now, I said last time that Otokonoko means crossdresser, and as any educated trans person will tell you, presentation doesn't equal gender identity. We've even seen that with other characters in this very video, but presentation can correlate and even be indicative of gender identity troubles. Makoto briefly stops wearing girl clothes, but snaps back shortly after Saki calls them out on it. But even after that, they still go out presenting male from time to time. By the end of the anime, they've managed to reconcile with their mom, who starts to accept them, and has now realized that they aren't exactly just man or woman. In other words, non-binary. And they recognize this on their own for the most part. And it comes at the end of a journey with experimenting and getting used to being themselves out in the open. This is one of the best portrayals of a gender journey that I've ever seen in any media, because it actually dives into the complexity and change that is inherent to a journey that many non-binary folks go on, including myself. Basically, if you're queer and you haven't seen this anime, go watch it. Next up we have Magni and Tiger again. I don't have too much to say about these two that I didn't already say in my MHA video a few months ago. Tiger is a trans man in a team that is otherwise all women. They all have feminine designs, but Tiger's attitude is still traditionally masculine, with him being perhaps the most physical member of the Wild Wild Pussycats. His identity is confirmed in the info pages of the manga, not in the story itself, but it's technically still canon. He shows up a few times after the arc that introduces him. He isn't really that important to the story then, but it's cool that he's there. Magni, on the other hand, I've got one simple problem with, and that's the fact that she dies very unceremoniously. I wouldn't be as annoyed by it if it wasn't literally right after her identity is brought up in the story. Something that isn't done for Tiger's identity. Bury your queers is a harmful trope that affects many queer characters. It says to people like us, you can't exist in media, and if you do, it's only for a minute. And when your existence is acknowledged, the character will be removed from the story shortly thereafter. It reflects societal attitudes that our existence is inherently abnormal, and that we are simply figures of tragedy. No, I'm not saying that portrayals like this make society hate us more. I am saying that positive portrayals can help instill a positive message. That's kind of the whole point of this video. And this is a mostly missed opportunity. Though to be fair, there is a silver lining in that her friends demand her identity be respected when she is misgendered by Overhaul. I could complain that this is done with a villain, but My Hero Academia has a long pattern of making its villains sympathetic. In fact, it's super important to the final arc. As if to say, despite their actions, they do have a point. Society did screw them over, and it's going to need systemic correction to prevent other people from suffering like they did. That being said though, Magni's identity isn't really brought up in the final arc like many others, despite it being centered on characters who became villains due to systemic issues, though the implication is still there. But even then, I do have to ask, if My Hero Academia is set in the far future, why is transphobia just as big an issue then as it is today? If I had to guess, I'd say Horikoshi probably didn't think this all the way through, or society fell apart and was restructured at some point. Despite my criticisms, I do appreciate that these characters are here, and that acceptance of their identities is portrayed as a good thing. It's a step forward, just not as big as it could have been. On that note, it's time to move on to our final series of the video. Despite My Hero Academia being my favorite manga, there are some things I do prefer about One Piece, such as the world building, and most important for this video, its portrayal of trans characters. First on the list is Bon Clay, an Okama, which is a term that ranges from describing queer men to crossdressers to trans women. Apart from his shapeshifting ability, he's also given both genders code names in the Baroque Works arc. In case you didn't remember, Baroque Works uses date-themed code names for its female members and number code names for its male members. Mr. 2 Bon Clay uses both. Even though it's never directly stated, the consensus is that Bon Clay is non-binary. Bon Clay very happily joins Luffy later on in Impel Down, and I love it. And then this happens. And that brings me to our next two characters, Emporio Ivankov and Inazuma. Emporio Ivankov is the user of the Horm fruit, which controls hormones, and those hormones can be injected into other people to all sorts of effects, including changing a person's gender, which Ivankov has done to several people who wish to live a more fluid lifestyle, including the aforementioned Inazuma. Pretty textbook gender fluid if you ask me, with Ivankov randomly remarking that she feels like being a woman right in the middle of a prison break. While Ivankov mainly uses the gender change on those who are willing, it's also used on a prison guard who actually felt much happier as a woman. But it is also used as a punishment. I could complain about that, but the character in question came to harm Ivankov because he was angry that his dad came home gay. A bit dubious, but it kinda fits. Of course, a story all about pirates fighting against a tyrannical government would be free-spirited when it comes to things like gender. Though, like with MHA, there are some issues. Namely, Sanji on the Kamabaka Island. in which he was shocked to find out that the person in front of him was not a cisgender woman, but an okama, and he ran like hell. Then he was forced to live as one of them. Even pre-transition, I never found any pervert jokes to be funny, and this whole arc kind of tries to make jokes out of some very transphobic stereotypes, like trying to trick people, see Lindsay Ellis's video for more details, and forcibly converting people. And when Sanji manages to leave the island, he considers it hell. This was a really weird, really uncomfortable arc, but I don't think it was intentionally so. Fortunately, we've now come to the best portrayal of trans identity in all of One Piece at this time, and that's Wano Country. The grand battle between the Straw Hats and their allies against Kaido and Big Mom. First up, we've got Kikunojo, or Kiku for short, a samurai from the land of Wano, and the only woman in the 9 red scabbards, it turns out. Her friends accept her for who she is when she declares that she is a woman at heart, and she's even allowed inside the woman's bath. She's not the most complex character, but she's a sweetheart who's also a badass samurai warrior. What is not to love? Not only that, but this arc also introduced my favorite character in the entire series, but also someone I've been hesitant to get to. I wanted to talk about this in my One Piece video a few months ago, but I didn't because I knew I'd have to address the controversy, and I couldn't figure out a way to fit it in there. But there is no better video for me to address this topic, so let's talk about Yamato, the son of Kaido. After being inspired by Kozuki Oden at a very young age, he claims that he is Oden, and that Oden was a man, so he became a man to emulate him. Kaido has treated him like shit his whole life, especially after he started emulating Oden, going so far as to put explosive handcuffs on his arm that he needs Luffy's help to remove. Funnily enough, Yamato didn't think Kaido would actually put explosive cuffs on his arms. He legitimately thought that his evil overlord father was bluffing, and was shocked that this turned out not to be the case. Quite the powerful moment of breaking free of an abusive, controlling parent. On top of that, he has one of my personal favorite devil fruits in the series, a mythical Zoan fruit that turns him into a freaking ice wolf. He's strong enough to fight his dad, albeit briefly, and he can use Conqueror's Haki. The controversy stems from whether Yamato is actually trans, or just assumed a masculine persona as part of emulating Oden. I looked into this, and I admit, I wish Oda wasn't so wishy-washy on it, especially considering how direct he was with Kiku, but I'm still convinced he's trans. He's referred to as male by most of the cast, even Kaido, who openly hates Oden, and the cherry on top, he bathes in the men's room. At the same time, Kiku bathed in the women's room. Like, I don't think there is much to debate here. And that unfortunately brings me to the conclusion which, unlike last video, is a lot more disappointed by how audiences have treated these characters. A lot of them are treated okay by fans, but there's a lot of misgendering and denial, not even exclusive to Yamato. I've seen characters like Kiku whose identities are explicit get regularly misgendered by fans, and that's not okay. Yes, the characters are not real, but they do represent a group of very real, very vulnerable people. Fiction isn't just an escape from reality, it can also give a different perspective on reality, and even help people express or understand something important. How else would you explain the number of real protests with Straw Hat pirate flags? The characters I've discussed can help trans people understand themselves better, perhaps help them realize that they aren't who they thought they were, or help them feel seen. No one I know who genders trans people correctly in real life has ever purposefully misgendered a trans character in a work of fiction. If I see someone doing that, it signals to me that I'm not safe to be taken seriously as a part of the fandom, or in general in those spaces. I do believe that some people who I won't name here have been too trigger-happy in calling certain media portrayals problematic, but these portrayals do matter. I've seen more than a few comments and a few YouTube videos across several fandoms from people who discovered they were trans or queer because of a character who was of that identity. And I've seen plenty of cishet people who became more accepting of those different from them for a similar reason. These characters can also be a source of comfort to the people who need it. Invalidating the character's identity is an invalidation of everyone who finds solace in that character and their story. The same even applies to trans headcanons. I'm not saying you need to agree with them. There are characters like Nia from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 that some other fans headcanon as trans because the character's story resonated with them due to their trans experience. I don't personally see Nia that way even though I am trans, Though I do see her as a trans icon. But if someone finds genuine joy in that, who am I to take that away from them? If someone sees a character as being of their identity and finds solace in them, or if someone is bothered by how a character who is of their identity is portrayed, don't try to force them to feel differently about it. We all have different experiences, and we experience media in different ways. We just need to respect those experiencing it different from us. Thank you all so much for watching. I'm Kylan Mythos, and I'll see you all next time.